people who were in a coma and had mind-blowing experiences. When they woke up, in the 90s, my great-grandfather had a stroke and was in a coma for 3 weeks. When he woke up, he had forgotten how to speak English and could only speak in the Choctaw language. He had learned it as a child because his family lived near the Choctaw Reservation and he played with many local kids back then. He spoke the language fluently, but had forgotten it over his lifetime and couldn't recall a single word by that time. This lasted for about 10 days, and then he woke up from a nightmare and suddenly could only speak English again without remembering a single word of Choctaw. The brain is a weird thing. If I'm not mistaken, there's a guy who, after waking from a coma, started speaking Cantonese and eventually ended up with a Chinese girlfriend. I was in a coma for 4 days, and when I woke up, everyone around me was talking about some baby of mine. I had lost my long-term memory and didn't even remember I was pregnant. My son was in the neonatal intensive care unit. I had an emergency C-section at 29 weeks due to complications from Crohn's disease. I found out about this after I woke up. During my pregnancy, my large intestine ruptured. My experience. My husband said I talked like a child when I first came to. When I woke up, I felt very tired, and in the following days, I was still a bit anxious. I remembered a conversation between my mom and a nurse while I was out of it. After a couple of days, my long-term memory returned, and I remembered everything up to my second surgery. My son was born during the third surgery. In general, my little boy was what surprised me the most. Update on my son. With your son, is everything okay? He weighed 1 kilogram and 407.4 grams. Now he's 18 years old and 195 centimeters tall. Thank you for asking. I was in a coma for 9 days, and when I woke up, I was still on a ventilator. When they disconnected me, my body didn't remember how to breathe on its own. I literally had to relearn how to do it, which took me several days. I had no natural sense of how long or deep to inhale, how long to hold my breath, and how long to exhale. I had to focus all my concentration on breathing, which was really scary. My struggles with breathing. For all those who were curious about how I slept, I didn't sleep the first couple of days. If I dozed off, my oxygen sensor would start beeping and wake me up, and then the nurse would yell at me across the ICU to remind me to breathe. I couldn't talk because I had tubes in my nose and throat, but I remember one time, very tired, I woke up to that damn beeping. Anyway, I started concentrating on breathing again, but it really pissed me off. My nurse would run over and shout at me to breathe. I looked at her and screamed with my non-existent voice, "I am breathing!" I guess she read my lips and felt my indignation, because she just threw up her hands and said, okay, good job," and then walked away. Sharing my story. I shared this because I never had the chance to before. My ability to breathe normally returned to me after about a month. As for my health, everything is fine now, so I wouldn't say it affected me permanently in any way. Well, thanks. Now I pay attention to every breath I take. Don't forget to blink. My mom's experience. My mom was in an induced coma for 3 months, and when she woke up, she thought the hospital was trying to kill her. She tried to get out of bed and fell on the floor because she couldn't walk. Mostly, she was scared because her legs had lost their shape. She had to relearn how to control every muscle. She couldn't speak properly at all, and had forgotten how to write. After relearning, her handwriting was different. She said she hated how perfect her hands looked. Her nails and cuticles were perfect and clean because they hadn't been used. I remember trying to comb her hair after she woke up. Almost all of it had fallen out. She was nearly dying every day she was in a coma. She had sepsis after diverticulitis following a failed surgery. Most of her hair grew back, and she was able to walk, but her brain was damaged, causing her to look very drunk. She always feels dizzy, but it's been 5 years, and her recovery can be called a miracle. A family friend's experience. A good friend of our family was in a coma for 6 months. When he finally woke up, he was confused because his wife looked so old. He had actually lost the last 15 years of his memory. I learned that he had 2 children, but they were infants, and he didn't even know about his third child. His memory never returned. He went from mobile phones to smartphones and laptops. Everything was new to him, stuck in the early 90s, but actually in the 2000s. He had to learn a lot, but learning that he had missed his children's growing up moments was the hardest for him.
The saddest story. This is the saddest story I've seen in this thread. Oh God, that's terrifying. He must have felt like it was a punishment for something terrible. My wife was in a medically induced coma for 2 weeks. When she woke up, she had false memories, all based on conversations that took place in her hospital room. For example, she thought she had flown to Washington for treatment while she was in a coma. My dad had been telling how he had just returned from a business trip to Washington, and somehow she overheard this while she was out of it. Her brain interpreted it as she had flown to Washington. Even after we explained the reality of where she was, it took days for her to accept the truth. My brother-in-law's experience. My brother-in-law had a brain tumor, so he was out of it for a while. When he was first brought to the hospital, the nurses were of Asian descent, so when he woke up, he apologized to people for making them come to Japan to see him. My cousin was in a coma for about 3 weeks, and when he woke up, he couldn't find his teeth. We completely forgot where we put them and looked for a whole week. At one point, he collapsed dead at the hospital sink for no apparent reason. He was resuscitated but couldn't understand why he could barely breathe. Then the doctors sat us down and showed us the x-rays. The dentures were inside. They had forgotten to take them out when they inserted the tubes in his mouth, which led to a blockage of the airway or something like that. So yeah, we found them. Sharing a photo. Since this has raised such interest, I decided to post a photo. The only thing I have on my old mobile is hope the link works. Here's the photo. Oh, damn, I haven't seen a BlackBerry in years. My experience with bacterial meningitis. I was in a coma for 4 days due to bacterial meningitis. When I woke up, I was completely deaf. I had to communicate with my parents and doctors using a notepad and pen. Gradually, sound returned to my left ear, but my right ear is still 100% deaf to this day. Another person's experience with bacterial meningitis. Another person who had bacterial meningitis. I'm so glad you survived. Things could have been much worse. Thank you, man. I'm glad I pulled through too. The doctors gave me a 10% chance of survival. Conversation with my mother. Yeah, you too, you made it. I talked to my mother and she said the doctors only gave me a 5% chance of surviving. Your mother, my wife, was in a medically induced coma for 4 days. She had a reaction to the contrast dye. Her heart stopped for 20 minutes. For almost 3 months, she was talking to her long-deceased parents as if they were in the next room. Or she would say she was talking to her daughter or brother, but they weren't calling. She constantly read that my mother and father were alive, which was driving me crazy when I had to gently correct her many times a day. She came up with amazing stories about what relatives, friends, and neighbors were doing, what they were talking about, really creative fiction. After 3 months, she started coming to herself. The hallucinations stopped. Everything changed. She can remember recent events, but long-term memories are gone. I don't know what it's like, but it must be terrible. Sometimes she cries over lost memories, but overall she's doing very well. My father's experience. My father had a reaction to the contrast dye after a head injury, which caused seizures. It was like a reboot of the brain. He could only say, "My girl," as my sister had just been born. He couldn't stop grabbing things, holding on to them. He underwent several months of therapy. Eventually his mood changed. He became very irritable, impatient, and very sleepy. Now he's okay, except for some neck pain. My cousin's experience. About 20 years ago, my cousin, after a fall, suffered a serious head injury. He was about 20 years old at the time and was in a coma for almost 4 weeks. When he woke up, he quickly discovered he had an eidetic memory. He could repeat any conversation word for word and even tell you the date and time of when you said something. Besides, he could memorize an image in just a few seconds. His memory is still eidetic, which is damn annoying. Every time he reminds me of something I said in the past, usually something I can't even remember. Suggestion to hit him again. I suggest hitting him on the head again. But considering what happened last time he was hit on the head, he'd probably just get another superpower. Better not risk trying to fix him. He's just malfunctioning. He needs to be turned off and on again. My experience with diabetic ketoacidosis sent me into a coma. I have vague memories of being sick. The overall sense of time was just like mush. Even years later, I can't establish the correct timeline. I have flashes of memories of different doctors coming in and out of the room. As soon as I came out of the coma, I was still out of it. I was on an insulin drip. Doctors checked my sugar every hour. I could never fall asleep. But all this time I felt like I was sleeping. It's hard to describe that feeling, just mushy, dragging time. I was in a coma for almost 6 weeks. When I woke up, I had to relearn everything. I retained most of my speech abilities, but my walking was terrible. I had to learn how to wipe my ass, as well as how to go up and down stairs. It took about 3 weeks. I also lost a ton of weight. I was 190 centimeters tall and weighed about 65 kilograms. 6 weeks, oh my God. My experience with a severe head injury, after which I had an MRI with dye, to which I was severely allergic. I died on the table within minutes. My nephew, 14 years old, was in a medically induced coma for more than 3 months. During that time, he lost about 30% of his body weight as his muscles atrophied. His first remark when he first saw himself was, "You forgot to feed me." It was incredibly hard to hear, as his family sat and cried by his bedside all the time he was unconscious. My experience in 2001, I was in a coma for 3 weeks, from the 2nd of September to 26, 2001. I was driving through Pennsylvania on my way to meet the head of marketing of the company I was working for at the time. I had started this trip on the 2nd of September, 2001, and I don't remember much of what happened except what the medics and hospital staff told me. But the gist of it is that I was hit or run off the road by a drunk driver who tried to cross 3 lanes to get to the exit I was on. Basically, I ended up in his blind spot at the wrong time, in addition to the fact that he was drunk as fuck. I think everyone here can guess what happened on the 11th of September, 2001. It felt like I was teleporting or time traveling because 1 minute I was behind the wheel, and the next I was busted up in a hospital bed with a brace on my back and neck, burns from airbag gas, an IV in my arm, and a few other minor injuries. When I woke up, I was in a completely different world than the one I left before I fell asleep. The economy was fine, the world was great, and then I woke up and it was all house. Thank you for watching. You can leave comments if you were in a coma, and if so, what did you wake up to? Plus, don't forget to check out other videos on our channel.